shall we go into the big one?
Yeah, let's go into the big one. So
the meta.
All right. So basically, when you think of the meta, is basically a concept that exists in competitive environments, right? Because if you want to compete against anything for a better result, for a better reward, you want to put forward or use the best tools possible, right? If like a 6 wrench or whatever the fuck measurement is that screws it a little bit tighter and better and faster, you're gonna use that instead of a 5 or instead of a 7 or whatever, right? That's the most basic example I can give. If something does whatever you're doing a little bit better and your goal is to do it the best as possible, you're going to choose that, that best tool possible.
It's true. I mean, I think everybody kind of knows what we're talking about when addressing meta in WoW, because you can look at raid comps, and you can look at Mythic Plus comps, and you can look at arena comps, right? And more specifically, there's a lot of questions and a lot of like pointing the fingers when it comes to like, oh, but this spec ain't meta. Oh, but this class ain't meta, or whatever. And you can prominently see this when you are not necessarily part of a guild or a community, and you just try and like do buy and get some proper progress within the game through LFG. I will give that example because I have stories on that, and I know a lot of other folks have stories on that. Meta in WoW has transformed. I mean, the concept was always there, at least in the competitive scene, and we'll get to the competitiveness of it and what that actually means for that echelon of gaming in WoW. But for your average Joe, the meta has been transformed into this monster where it's basically a gate for people to either get accepted or not into different game modes within the game. My story is that in season 1, I believe, in Shadowlands. Right. Yeah, I think it was in season 1 or in season 2. I'm not sure. I know I restarted playing on my rogue because I was prepping him for 9.1.5, 9.1. Yeah, I rated 9.1 on my rogue, yeah. And I really wanted to get my KSM, right? So I bugged a couple of keys as sub and assassination. And at the time, these specs were not I wouldn't say not good, but they weren't looked at with good eyes. Yeah. Okay, they were not performing. I mean, sub was still like really, really shit. Assassination was decent, but outlaw was the main thing, and I never really enjoyed outlaw as much as the other two specs. Granted, I found it fun at its capacity. I always got rejected after a couple of tries. I went in as an assassination with a pug group, and I did the key with them. I did okay, but then they said, listen, we want to push tonight for 3 of them to get KSM, but you have to switch to outlaw if you want to remain with us. And that was like, one thing is like, man, but why? Because I proved my worthiness, let's say, as assassination at the time. I did like almost the same amount of damage as I was. Fire mage was it back then? I cannot remember, but I did good. I wasn't like below the tank, or that was either top 1, top 2 in the key. And they said that, okay, you want to get KSM. There's 3 other people in our group that want to get KSM, but if you want to join us, you have to switch to outlaw. And this is one example of where people see outlaw in the MDI, see outlaw like in all of the logs for the high keys, and they say, yeah, okay, this was in first season. Okay, outlaw is pretty bad right now, but talking from the past, they see that shit and they expect that spec being meta, that's like the way to go. Neglecting and forgetting about the fact that a lot of people, such as myself, Flame, and we can I'm sure a lot of folks from our community here, master some of their specs which are not necessarily meta but can do much better than, let's say, a person who goes for the quote-unquote meta spec. And this happens so many times. I've played on a lot of specs that were not necessarily, but they're actually underdogs and overperformed the so-called meta specs. It's ridiculous. This is my biggest issue with the concept of meta in World of Warcraft right now. It's a gate for people to get into, and if they do not play what is considered to be meta at the time, I'm talking about the average Joe, then they don't get in. And it's a big fucking problem. Go ahead.
Yes, and since we're talking about, personal stories, fundamentally, both of us played under meta specs the entire expansion.
I played sub, but I didn't know it would become meta.
At the time when Marcelian chose sub, I
wanted it from the edge of
we didn't know that it was going to be the beast that it is. But
as I said, I started playing my rogue once again in 9.0 as an alt after my feral. So
yeah, but the point is, we didn't choose the specs that we wanted to play because they were meta. And it's not like, oh my god, we're so much better than everybody else. No, it's a point of understanding that as long as you like a spec and you master it, and we use the term spec, but if you apply the concept of meta, it can be applied to everyday life as well. But we're gonna keep it in WoW terms. If you master a spec, you're going to do a lot better, especially if you like it, because there's a level, right? So if you can think of a spec's performance as a scale from a 0 to 100, right? Let's take Feral right now, right? Because I started the Feral challenge on stream, which you may or may not know. Let's say the Ferals, if I am the best Feral in the world, if I play the spec perfectly, I can get a performance level of 100, right? Let's put that number out there, just a level of 100, right? However, if I play my Destro Warlock and I play perfectly, I might be able to get 150 or 170 or 180, right? Obviously, Destro Warlock cap is higher, right? The overall ceiling. However, for the regular content that we do, even up until 20, if we're gonna keep these in these weird numbers, you only need like a performance level of 80 or 90, right? So you could say that if I play Feral perfectly, I can do enough just to get the key done. If we're gonna talk in Mythic Plus terms, I can just clear the content just enough to get it done. I'm not gonna blast it out of the park, right? Now, what comes into play is that people make mistakes, right? Whenever you're striving to achieve a goal, you make mistakes. So sometimes having an overperforming tool solves those mistakes, right? If somebody dies or misses a kick or the tank dies or blah, blah, blah. If you have a Warlock that does double the damage of everybody else, and if we're talking about the meta now, obviously that compensates, right? So when you talk about meta, you talk about, compensating some of this stuff, right? And when you go into higher and higher keys, 25s and higher and 30s right now, right? That's where the meta is actually important. We can start to talk about why this is important. So meta right now actually operates and exists in its true form in, let's say, if we're talking about Mythic Plus, because it's easier, plus 30 and 31 keys now, and Race to World First, MDI, and AWC if you play PvP as well. Because those players take the game at the highest level of the highest level possible, where every percent matters. Because if I'm gonna be playing, let's say, a Feral against a Destro Warlock, and the Destro Warlock does double the damage in a 30, I'm not going to be able to contribute. So when we're talking about the community perception and when is meta important, if you're pushing those high keys, I get it. Listen, if I want to push 30s, I will bite the bullet and not play my Pro Warrior and play maybe a Blood Decay or a Vengeance Demon Hunter, right? I understand that. Okay, the game is made so that everybody can enjoy it and everybody can achieve whatever they want. But if you want that extra thing, that extra step, yeah, that elitism, you're going to have to play the best of the best. And that's where that matters. Meta doesn't matter in plus 10s, plus 15s, and even plus 20s, right? If I would take, let's say, a very experienced Feral that can do that can do 14 or 16k overall damage in a key to do my 20s, then a Warlock that just picked up this Warlock right now and sometimes can do 20k, sometimes can do 8k. And as an example, I've played just to prove that, as long as you understand the spec, and we might have if we're gonna put this on YouTube, we might have some footage about it. I've played BM Hunter with my Hunter. I only had double legendaries, 240 eye level, something like that, no tier set. Finished the dungeon with like 11k, something above a Destro Warlock that had 4 set, 270 eye level, that just wasn't that versed on the spec. This is not necessarily to say that I'm a better player, but I was a better hunter than he was or she was at being a Destro Warlock. This is just to point out that if you practice what you like, you're going to get the most out of it. And if then you hit a wall that you cannot overcome, then you can start thinking about, okay, what is actually meta?
That's the thing, man. I think like the overall situation we have here is that meta, the concept of meta in WoW is 100% legit in very competitive gameplay. So Flame mentioned Race to World First, 30 keys, whatever you push after 26 and 27, that's where it becomes relevant, because there players will take in every 0.5% advantage they could take and roll with it. That's fine over there. The problem is, where is that mentality comes and gets applied to your 15s, to your 70s, even to your 20s at some point. After doing so many tier lists and looking at so many logs and performances for the trillion different specs and then seasons and affixes and whatever, I think we can safely say that all the specs can do at least a 19 to 20 key. That in terms of like what Flame was mentioning in terms of its performance, to be able to finish that key, because you'll always have one spec that will do better than the other. But if you master your spec, you can 100% say fuck the meta. If you want to play super competitively, that's legit. Okay, meta really counts there, and you always saw it. Like, I think it's a tricky subject to talk about the meta in raids, because a lot of fights require or are catered to specific mechanics or abilities from different specs. Meta is not that stable over there. Sure, you can talk about a meta after the Race to World First and clearance and Hall of Fame and all of that.
Yeah.
But after the fact, and you get a lot of nerfs. We always saw this. We get a lot of nerfs after, let's say, a month after a raid was out or after the Race to World's First was ended. And then you can talk about an established meta in raids as well. At Mythic Plus, however, and even in arenas, it's kind of stable from the get-go. Once people start seeing those numbers, seeing those AWCs, MDIs, and then logs, Raider.io, sub-creation, Warcraft logs. Once people start to see that, and I think it's a problem where people don't accept it, but they get influenced by it 100%. If you have a group, and you tell me how many times this happened to you. You're in a group with your friends or whatever, right? You're looking for a DPS bug, okay? And a random Feral Druid or Red Paladin applies. How many times did you reject that? Because in that list, there was also a Fire Mage or, I don't know, a Boomkin in last season or whatever. You would obviously go, that's like the instinct you would go for, because this is what the high-end game dictates. Forgetting the fact that for a small key or a medium key, you don't need that high level of performance. You just need a player who understands his class or spec and can deliver his performance to, let's say, the best he can, rather than the flavor of the month boy. And I think your example was perfect.
Yeah, just your point as well. I think it happened either Tuesday or last week, where one of our viewers, Mr. El Ricardo, I don't know if you're in the chat or not, plays a Ret and a Prot Paladin at 3.3k, and I was doing a key with a Pug, and we just needed one more DPS. There were 2 Warlocks, and I was either the tank or the healer. And he applied to the group, and since I wasn't the leader, I couldn't get him in, although I tried to talk the people to get him in. They said that they wanted a Bloodlust and not a Ret. He's a 3.3k IO Ret, and the damage that he normally does in keys far outweighs the extra 15% haste that you would get from a Bloodlust as opposed to a Drum if we would have gotten him into the key. So just that goes to show people's mentality and how they think about things like this. So, like Marcelian said, any spec can do up to 19 and 20, and why that's important is because that's where the game content ends, realistically. That's where you get all the highest achievement, the mount, all of the rewards in the game for performance stop at around plus 20 keys, because we can talk that, right? Plus 20 keys or 3k IO, because that's what you get all the 20s and you get 3k IO or something like that. And that's where it stops, right? There's nothing after that. After that, it's only prestige, right? Yeah. So when it comes to prestige, sure. If you want prestige,
you go and push,
go for that 1% more or whatever.
Go for the meta, sure.
Or you can play off meta and be rank 1 Feral, rank 1 Red, rank 1 Unholy, or whatever, Outlaw right now. What's kind of like at the bottom of the barrel right now. You might see tomorrow.
It's a good point. I'm sorry, I cannot keep track of all of your comments, but I do read them as we go through. And somebody underlined this, with the IO score. And Goofy makes a good point. You talked about this. So eye level and IO score means nothing versus meta spec, sadly. So even if you see a 3.3k Red Paladin, you still have this mentality of, what the fuck, I need the Bloodlust, or I need this meta spec. It happens to so many people, and I feel for the Red Paladins and the Feral Druids that really do well, and they're not getting invited.
It's a back and forth topic, and I agree and also disagree, because sure, maybe your composition needs a mechanic rather than a performance, right? I mean, Bloodlust, we can say Bloodlust is meta or not. Bloodlust has always been meta. However, the thing is, if you're going to reject an off-meta option, reject it for the right reason, not because people choose Destro Warlocks and they don't understand why. People choose, man, Destro Warlocks is easier and less punishing right now, but I've played a Destro Warlock in keys with tanks that constantly took shit out of my Rain of Fire. That is incredibly infuriating, and you can say, oh, you don't get to do your damage, but listen, in the context of Destro Warlocks, and this is a good example to explain why metas work, because the reason metas exist is because somebody at the peak tested it and created the strategy, right? The strategy for this Warlock is pretty straightforward. You press Rain of Fire, it generates shards, you spend shards, which give you free rain of fire, which gives you infernals, which give you more shards, which give you more infernals, more rain of fires, more shards, and this constantly goes on a loop, right? If shit goes out of Rain of Fire, that loop is broken. You not only don't do damage, you don't generate the shards, you don't generate the tier set bonus, you don't generate the core mechanic of what the spec does, right? So it doesn't matter if I play a Destro Warlock, if the tank keeps taking shit out of my Rain of Fire, I won't be able to perform, I won't be able to put out all of that meta. So the reason why this is important is because if you're going to play meta, understand why meta is good and make it work, play around the meta. Another argument that we had and we talked about before was Fire Mage, right? If you're not pulling around combustion and you're not pulling like big packs every 1 minute, and how long is combustion with kindling right now? Then you're wasting your Fire Mage, and there's no point. And if a tank cannot do that, we're talking about tanks, right? But we can talk about anything. If a tank cannot work around the meta, then there's no point in playing the meta. And the truth of the matter is, in pugs and up until like 20 keys, because 20s right now are kind of like the old 15, 17s.
Yeah.
Tanks don't know how to play with most DPS, so what's the point of playing a Destro Warlock if my Feral can do just as much damage, just because my Feral isn't as restricted around shit being in the same place for as long, right? So this goes into the topic of understanding why meta works instead of just blindly following it.
Yeah, I guess what we're trying to get across here, and we tried this with our tier list videos for the longest time, is like, dude, at the end of the day, if you like a spec and like really enjoy playing it, but it's not necessarily in the meta, keep on keeping on, man, because this is how I believe this whole perception and community and way of playing the game moving forward will change. You cannot always switch to the flavor of the month specs all the goddamn time, you know, master none, and expect to have a good time in the game. And this affects everybody, from people who pug, from guilds who are missing a DPS or a healer or a tank and are pugging as well. Not to mention the big problem we have in arenas. I mean, if you look at the statistics in PvP, we're gonna briefly touch it because I know not a lot of folks play it, but it's an interesting one for the meta as well. The statistics show, for the, I would say, longest time right now, that RMP, right, Rogue Mage Priest, is dominant in all aspects of 3v3. And this is, again, another, so you're gonna see people looking for players in terms of like making a comp or whatever. Most of them are going to be looking for a mage or a priest. This is it, and this is a big problem because, guys, this game has 36 different specs, soon to be 38, I believe, with the evokers, right? How about we make it so, because I don't really believe it's necessarily a Blizzard problem. I mean, it's a Blizzard problem to a point, but then it's a community problem to a whole different point. Flame mentioned that the meta works and is viable at the competitive gameplay. And the example was great because after 20 keys, if you want to push further and further, you want to get your prestige up, you want to have bragging rights, that's all cool, then I can 100% agree with you that, okay, I'm looking for the meta spec because it does have the numbers, it does have the utility, and also the meta, sadly, the meta for the average Joe doesn't really take into consideration utility. This is another important aspect. People don't think about what a spec can bring other than its DPS. Talking DPS here. Big problem. The
reason this is in the inherent design of Mythic Plus, where the Mythic Plus, the health of mobs and the damage they do scales numerically, but mechanics don't scale at all. Mechanics are the same, which is why utility starts to dwindle down and why numbers are more important, why healers have to do damage. Right, because a lot of people complain that healers have to do damage. Well, listen, if you're going to play in a content that, because Mythic Raid is different, and we can talk about Mythic Raid as well. If you're going to play in a content where the difficulty is just bigger numbers, then you're going to counter that with bigger numbers, right? That's the only way that you can do it. the thing is, Mythic Plus has been adapted from Diablo 3's Greater Rifts, which is a little bit different because in Greater Rifts, I don't know how they are now, but when I played them just before they got into WoW, adapted into WoW, when you went, it's same thing. You go into like an instant zone with a lot of mobs, and the higher level you do it, the more HP and damage they have. At one point, it mattered if you had CC because you can just group everything up. And if you have like good slows, good stuns, or good roots, you can just damage them without them ever hitting you, meaning that the damage that they do, the damage that they get from scaling up, they don't ever get to do to you, so your HP doesn't matter. And your damage may or may not matter, but if you can hit 100 mobs at once instead of 20, your damage scales that way instead of scaling, progressively as you get gear or player power. And because AoE cap has been taken out of the game, that concept no longer functions in Mythic Plus content, meaning that damage matters more. Because when you had uncapped AoE, you could bring, let's say, I don't know, we can talk about Red Paladin, we can talk about Frost Mage, which wasn't meta in BFA when AoE was uncapped. We can slow so many mobs at a time that melee mobs don't exist anymore because they never reach you to hit them, so you can just damage them for infinity, right? For however long the key is. So content design and encounter design matters, and that's where Blizzard is right now. And because we have Shadowlands systems with player power multiplied by player power multiplied by player power multiplied by player power, you have these huge ass skews between specs like Distro Warlock and Outlaw Rogue, who are like the top end of the spectrum in terms of damage performance, and why healers have to do damage. So I get it, people don't like to do damage with healers. However, if you are pushing keys, you have to accept that fact. And that's when you start to embrace the meta.
It's part of the lifestyle. Circling back to the utility of the specs, I was having a nice conversation with one of our patrons, Mr. King, the whole majesty, King Ragnar, and who also plays the Red Paladin, and we're kind of discussing the fact that, you know, what kind of a value can you bring when you get a Red Paladin, or just a Paladin in general, okay? But we're talking specifically DPS because this is like the major fact. Most people play DPS. This is a known fact, okay? So if you play a Red Paladin or a Feral Druid or whatever, you're gonna have this situation. Now, I tried to put my point across. His is like, okay, first of all, as a red, you can basically save your team with a taunt and bubble. If shit hits the fan, then you'll be a blessing for your tank. Lay on Hands is another very good, and I cannot tell you how many times Lay on Hands saved the tanks, Mr. Flame here. And that on top of I think there's 3 dungeons where the dispels for red are like blessings. You know, Necrotic Wake, Plague Fall, and all of that. It helps the healer out, the off heals, the freedoms, the stuns.
See, that's the point of utility that I mentioned, because if they scale, we're talking about the core, let's say the dispels, which are very important. If the dots of the debuffs, let's say, scale with the key, let's say it gives you, I don't know, 10% healing reduction, and a +1 gives you 50% healing reduction. That's when the spells become important. Because Blizzard isn't designing content that takes advantage of people's utility will not matter. So only thing that matters is numbers.
That's what I'm saying. So you may not have a meta spec like a Feral Druid who also dispels and off heals and has roots and whatnot and speed, and there's a lot of good things for mostly hybrid specs, and they're not meta. And one of their biggest advantages is these tools, and I would blame some of the player base for this, because not all people who play these specs actually make use of that. When you play like some sort of a hybrid class, again, I'm referring to Red Paladin because I'm biased, you cannot play like a warrior. Because as a red, you always have to be aware. You have to do your damage, but you also have to always have another eye on your team. Be that for their health, for their poisons, for their CC, for whatever. This is how it goes, and I love that about Red Paladins, right? But not all people play it like that, and it's a big mistake. On the other side of the spectrum, you're gonna have folks that are pugging, and when they see Red Paladin, all they think about is the damage, which okay, we can argue about Red Paladin's damage. I can tell you that it does amazing. But it's not only that, a fucking spec doesn't only bring DPS, and you cannot do a dungeon just with damage. You can talk about numbers, sure, it's a numbers game at the end of the day, but come on. I mean, you have to CC, you have to help your party in some way or another, and this is what's beautiful about playing a team-based MMO in a Mythic Plus environment. I think people forgot about that, and this is the fault of the meta. And we're not. You wrote down here something. I'll let you say it. This line over here. I think this is the best thing you ever read.
Oh, really?
In the last 5 years, all right? So you say it. You say it. I think that's a proper conclusion.
You mean playing meta is fine, but blaming meta is not.
Yeah.
So playing meta is fine. If you want to play meta, but blaming the meta is not. And what I mean by blaming the meta is by, you know, and I see what you're saying, Mr. Ricardo, and we had this talk yesterday as well. And my agreeing or disagreeing with you is very contextual to the level of content that you do. Because up until 20 keys or content that's, you know, above average but not top end, I disagree with you. In high end content, I agree. I mean, Marcelian can probably contest this the best. He's played red. I don't know if how squishy he felt or how his damage felt.
It is squishy, yeah.
Yeah, it's squishy. But, did you ever feel up until 20s that your damage was not enough?
No.
Yeah.
No.
So, and when we play our keys, we don't play meta specs. I'm a pro warrior, he's a red. We have a BM hunter friend or Havoc Demon Hunter, which is better, but it's still not, you know, survival sub Windwalker, right? So we don't play meta and we still get keys done. So in that sense, you know, that's where blaming meta is silly. If you want to do plus 30 and you say, oh, I'm bringing my Affliction Warlock, and you're like, no, you're bringing your Destro Warlock. If you want to do a plus 30, then yes, that's when playing meta is fine. And you can play meta in 15s as well, and that's okay. But don't limit your player group or player base into your 15s by just, you know, getting Destro's Warlock.
Up until a point, it's Blizzard's fault. And from another point, it's the community perception as well. And this is, again, something that we've tried to the best of our capacity to fix or just contribute to the solution within our tier list videos. Because when we do tier list videos, we do talk about meta because we're looking at the highest keys, highest performances, biggest parses, and whatever. So that's how we rank them. But we always try to underline this. I think we're like broken records on those videos. You play something that you enjoy, just do it, regardless if it's meta or not. Playing the meta is fine. You know, blaming the meta is not. You cannot blame the meta that, you know, you cannot do your 17 keys or whatever. If you play any spec and you master it, you're going to do just fine. Playing meta is fine, again, when you're trying to push yourself and become more and more competitive. This is what we're saying. And it's a lot of work to be done from Blizzard's part, and it's also a lot of work to be done from the player base part as well.